Cool, thanks, Jamie. So we've already recorded the interview, but now we can do a quick little introduction. So thanks for being part of Blue Ocean. We're trying to do something new in the area and have these real, honest conversations about success, achievement, and the intimate stories behind the success and achievement. And yeah, my hope is that these conversations will help inspire people and help relate to people who are trying to do their best in the world and to pursue whatever they define as success. What do you think of Blue Ocean, Jamie, and what we're trying to do?
I think that Blue Ocean really addresses one of the most unspoken about but fundamental topics to success, which is how do you keep your head screwed on as you're putting yourself under intense pressure to perform in competitive environments. And that could be getting into a university, it could be getting ducks of your school, it could be competing at a national sporting level, it could be playing high stakes esports with a team that is around you. But I think what Blue Ocean really aims to do is to first of all normalize the fact that this is a critical balancing act, critical challenge for everyone who's pushing themselves at a high level that really unifies people across backgrounds, and also give you really concrete strategies and tactics you can use in your own life to perform at a higher level. So I personally am fascinated to listen and see what other guests around Blue Ocean will have to say about this really interesting chart. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's exciting. I really hope that this show of courage and vulnerability can open this conversation and this new way of looking at ourselves and the people around us. How was the conversation? Now that we've already had it, how was it for you?
I would say it was quite therapeutic, to be honest, because I sort of took a deep dive into some of my, funky motivations and some of those challenging experiences that really stain who you are in a good and a bad way, and are quite foundational. And I think for these kind of things, the more you understand them, the more you're equipped to sort of keep growing and evolving. So I found it really quite fun to unpack some of these experiences and put frameworks and examples around things that I'd never really said out loud before. So yeah, I thought it was illuminating and really enjoyable. And also it was challenging. There were hard questions that I had to confront, and there wasn't clear answers to some of them. So I enjoyed trying to figure it out on the fly with you.
And I know there's been some time since we last chatted. How did those conversations settle in your mind, or did they not? Was it something you'd already said before?
No, actually, I've done lots of interviews over the last several years on all kinds of things, from Crimson's journey to my personal academic journey to different kind of like how-to guides and stuff. But I think like almost everything we discussed was totally unique. I'd never said it out loud, honestly, to anyone before. So it was really interesting. And I think following the discussion, I just spent a bit of time mulling on some of the things we talked about, and really spent a bit more time thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to set myself up for really high performance in terms of those different pillars we described in 2021, and in a virtual environment where some of the sort of physical intimacy or like physical relationships you might have with your it could be your partner or your family or whatever, from just simply hugs or spending time in the same room or something like this, is lost in a kind of virtual, slightly more colder world. How do you maintain those foundational pillars? So I think it was fun reflecting on what they were for me in high school, and then trying to figure out what they are now and how I can make them even stronger as I continue to try and put myself under some pressure to perform and do what I love to do.
Yeah, man. I think one thing that came out for me based on our conversation was just this idea of story and narrative, and how we have the agency to build that. And it is in the reflection and relating to other people's story that we can find the dips, the valleys and the hills and the mountains in this story, and how these inflection points crafted our path. So I mean, that's really a big hope of mine, that Blue Ocean will help people build their own stories, and stories that are empowering, and help them amongst the tumult of just everyday living, whether that's COVID, whether that's going online, whether that's just the normal vagaries of life. So with that, thank you so much for doing the interview.
It was an honor. Looking forward to more of them. Have a good one.
Great. So let's try it, man. We have a bit of time, like, and yeah. So like, I guess I want to put you the question that if we had this community, and if you could speak to this community that we both know and understand, that being high performers, competitive people who seek opportunity and want to do good for the world. What about what about your journey, and what part of your life would you think would help them? Um,
Um, I think the area that I would probably dive deep in would be my last year of high school. And the reason why I would focus on that is I think high school is this boiling pot of pressure, which gets hotter and hotter as you go through the years, as you inevitably get to this critical milestone of like the college admissions process. Now, by year 13, I was obsessed with this process. I knew that my academics really mattered. Like getting ducks actually really mattered. Like if I didn't get ducks, it might mean that I wouldn't get into Harvard, because Harvard only basically takes the kid, who has ducks from my school each year. So in my mind, I basically had very little room for error. And when you're like 14, that goal date, that judgment day is many years removed. But as you get closer to those last years of high school, and you're running out of time to get things done, the applications are coming in soon, and basically you're about to, go through this process. That's when pressure's kind of at its peak. And I think for me, there was of course those dynamics, but also at the same time, I was going through like a really challenging family dynamic too. And basically, for some context, I grew up with my mum, Paula, and she went through a pretty hard divorce when I was really young. So basically, raised me by herself. And my main sort of like father or figure type was actually my grandfather, who grew up with us and my grandmother. Now my grandmother was going through really intense Alzheimer's. So at this point, like she basically didn't recognize any of us. And it was a great source of like sadness for our whole family, but my granddad in particular. And so, in that last year, I saw, a really critical role model to me, really crumbling, I guess, under this, imminent realization that his love of 60 years, didn't recognize him, was really lost in many of the ways that, he was used to having her in his life for. And so I kind of had to manage, like step up, I guess, and manage supporting, previously my own support system, while also dealing with this boiling pot of pressure. And then the other thing is I was really isolating myself socially as well in that last year, because I was really actively cutting out going to any random parties. I was cutting out just hanging out with my friend groups a lot, to be honest. And so I probably was almost like somewhat reclusive to the extent that I was so focused on the academics. And I did, have some, of course, like friendships and stuff that I was, working on developing throughout that year. But many of my long-standing friends from high school, in that last year of high school, they were all having a blast and celebrating the end of high school, and I was feeling max pressure and using every last bit of time I could to really focus. So it was that combination of me in a very different social position mindset than all my peers that I really loved and cared for deeply, as well as this family dynamic, and then the pressure of the pending Harvard thing I was applying for all coming together. And so if there was a time I was going to really crack, it would probably be in that year 13 year.
mm, mm, mm. It sounds like a lot of moving parts, right? It's kind of the personal expectation and personal goals that you kind of can control and choose. But then there's all these other moving parts that you can't control, right? Like the family dynamic, having to step up and support adults, right? As when you're still kind of like a child. That's a huge responsibility and something you don't choose, but is kind of foisted upon you.
Totally. And I think, this happens to family, like a lot of children that have like divorced parents. And I think in my case, actually, it wasn't that bad, because I didn't like, I wasn't there for, really for the divorce. I was a little baby. But for lots of families that go through a divorce when the child's in high school, it can be so devastating, because they grow up with this assumption that there's this lovely support structure, the relationship they see the most in their life, their mum and dad relationship normally. When that crumbles, it's like, one of the, paradigms of the matrix just gets cracked.
Mm.
And then you really have to rebuild how you identify these core relationships around you. So I think for me, it was very bizarre to see this tough Scottish guy, my grandfather, who never cried, was rock solid, was always the guy to not share his emotions and stuff, be in a really, challenged place during this year, and see almost the total unwinding of a lot of those things. And I think that was quite jarring for me, because arguably, like, that was a time where I would have loved that support system even more. And
Mm,
I was in turn kind of like rather being a provider of that support, as opposed to sort of the warm fuzziness I would have had in the earlier years.
mm. And so how did you balance that, the seeming responsibility, the family responsibility, and the personal goals?
Um, it's a good question. So in my family, I guess my grandparents, my mum, my stepdad Glenn, they were very committed to my education, and it was really a whole tribal effort. Like, I think of this as an interesting example, but in our house in Glendowie, and right in the middle of this brick house that we grew up in since I was like 4. There's like a dining room table, and for all of year 13, that dining room table, which was like the central room in the house, was just covered with math practice exams, covered with Cambridge A-level pass papers. I would sit there and I'd have my tutoring, I'd do my studying, and that kind of honestly was a metaphor for like the role of education, and particularly my family's focus on me doing well academically in the family. Like, it really was literally the center of everyone's like focus. So my mum, even though she had her different working constraints and stuff, she was really putting everything into me. So I really felt like it was critical that I maintain that execution, because my success academically was a source of pride, strength, and fulfillment for my mum and for my granddad as well. So at a time where other things were kind of cracking, it was sort of all the more important that I was sort of delivering on what my family had poured into me for many of these years. And so yeah, I felt priority number one was make sure I'm hitting these goals, getting ducks, getting into these great colleges, taking everything as seriously as possible. My mum was investing a lot into tutoring and things like this, and making sure I was really respecting all of that, time, and really putting in the work for those hours. And then on a personal note, it was really to make sure that, like, my grandboys had, someone to talk to. I was looking after my grand as much as I could, and taking those responsibilities, off my granddad's shoulders as much as I could. And then also looking out for my mum as well, who was in a pretty delicate state given the state of my grandmother. So I would say it was more like a support system role, going from person to my family to person to my family as they needed me throughout that journey. And just also spending a lot of time at home, particularly doing my studying, but just around them during these, pretty intense family moments. So that
Mm.
was kind of like how I thought about it. Like, I would say my goal was still very much clearly on the academic side. And I think if I had compromised on that, like, it would have really made my family quite sad, because they would have seen that it was really affecting this goal we'd had as a unit for many years.
Right. So the academic side was also sort of familial responsibility, and it felt like somewhat of a duty in that it was a tribe, you're doing it for the whole family effort rather than just for yourself.
That's right. Yeah, there was this real notion of sort of like intergenerational mobility, where, like, my granddad, didn't get to go to high school and graduate. He won a full scholarship to a top British boarding school, couldn't afford to go because of like the uniform and travel costs, for his family. He went and worked in like merchant shipping and a lot of blue collar industries and stuff, and moved to New Zealand when he was quite young. Then my mum, she took advantage of like free education in New Zealand and cranked like an MBA law degree, chartered accounting degree, commerce degree, and really put a lot of effort into getting into eggs as an out of zone student, even though she lived in Manurewa. Eggs, Epsom Girls Grammar, which at the time was like the highest ranked girl public school that she could get into. So she was really heavy on education with everything that she had, despite limited ability to actually invest in like any kind of like paid programs. And then for me, it was very much the next phase of that sort of like evolution. So my mum had really worked hard to get me into St. Kitts Prep, and I had like scholarships to go there, and same thing with King's and a scholarship as well. And it was really this idea that it was on my shoulders to sort of like take things to the next level on the education and academic side.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. And that's such a cool progression, right? From your granddad, from, the merchant docks to immigrating, and there's the movement physically, but also academically, right? That's such a beautiful story. I wonder, so in this, when you first
talked about this last year at high school, it seemed to me there were three parts, right? There was the academic goal, the D-Day, when you'd know if you're ducks or not, and whether that helped you get into Harvard. The family troubles, your grandma, Alzheimer's, you're seeing your granddad, who's a stoic, solid figure, kind of deteriorate as well. And then the third part was, this last year of high school where people were celebrating, and there's this notion of, like I remember for me in seventh form, it was kind of like everything to the wind. We don't care anymore. Let's just have fun. So that third part, what was that like for you, seeing that around?
Yeah, so I'm actually a pretty social guy. I love and in high school I had a really diverse set of friends from folks that didn't end up going to university, and we love to talk about cars and poker and all kinds of funny things, all the way to buddies from sports to like my really academic, pretty nerdy groups as well. So and I dated throughout high school, and I loved sort of going to different parties and stuff. My first business was actually a party business where I used to rent like get a DJ, rent like strobe lights and stuff, and charge like entry fees, and run these sort of weekend parties at my house. So basically that was an important element of my life, and it was a real source of like stress relief. It was a real source of fun, motivation, balance. So like I'd always be grinding hard on academics. Then on my Saturday or something, I'd hang out with a lot of my friends, and that would be a pattern for many, many years, like from sort of year 7 onwards. So I would often be like the one like driving the gatherings and sort of hosting the big get-togethers and stuff. And so in year 13, when I sort of really battened down the hatches and really focused, it was quite an abrupt shift. And at some points, you feel quite lonely because everyone's thinking about like the ball, or they're thinking about like the graduation parties, or they're thinking about random parties throughout the course of year 13, and people are taking it a bit chill, and they're thinking about where they're going to head to next with these friend groups. And a lot of my friend groups are thinking about New Zealand or Australia, and so I was sort of isolating myself in terms of the goal, going to this totally foreign land of America, and then also isolating myself from a lot of those typical things I was doing for year 9 to year 12 as well. So I just had more time to crank the academics. So I think that was challenging and somewhat destabilizing, perhaps, to not have that pillar as strong in that last year. Hard to know whether it was the right call or not. And I mean, in hindsight, it worked well, but it was definitely more stressful. And I think when you remove that social layer, you start to kind of open yourself up to greater risk of burnout and things like that.
Right. So it kind of added to the feeling of loneliness in this process. And so in this time, what did you want for yourself?
In the year 13 year.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to finish strong. I kind of had this idea in my mind that from year 3, year 2, I'd been kind of grinding hard in the academics. This was my thing. And I had topped my year academically 4 years in a row at King's, and I wanted to finish strong and then get into a great university and set up for a wonderful career. So I think finishing strong was big, and I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to take as many subjects as I could, do a lot of additional extracurriculars and activities. And I really enjoyed a lot of this stuff. Like, it was so fun in year 13 going to all the debate competitions with my buddy Richard and Ashley and sort of rocking those and stuff. And there was a lot of joy throughout the process, but I was definitely trying to cram in as much as I possibly could. That was the first thing. And then, of course, providing that stability for my family, and making sure that I was there. My granddad was going to be okay from a health perspective, and the sort of fabric of support and warmth that we had in our home was very much maintained through this challenging time, or as best as possible. So they were the two priorities that I really had in that year 13 year. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you define finishing strong?
I mean, finishing strong for me was defined quite pragmatically. It was getting ducks. It was getting into a Harvard or a Cambridge, etc. It was, winning subject prizes. It was, wrapping up my Duke of Edinburgh, getting some different competition results and like debate tournaments, engineering tournaments, things like this. yeah, so it was very much like after years of grinding in different areas of my extracurriculars and academics, getting to sort of the highest accolade I could, getting my further maths done, getting university math coursework done, and making sure that the essays I submitted to these US schools were my best possible work. The references that I submitted were or requested from my teachers were the best people that I could choose to write them. I had applied for as many possible schools as I could, so I wasn't leaving anything on the table. That to me was really finishing strong.
Okay, so that makes sense. How based on that experience and the years after, how would you help someone who is in a difficult situation, who feels lonely, isolated, and has responsibilities foisted upon them? How do they finish strong despite the feeling of loneliness and stress?
That's a good question. I think the first thing is you want the person to know that they are not alone in these feelings. This is a natural apex moment where they're getting to the end of the race. They've been running for years and they're getting probably a little bit tired, and the stakes have reached the highest point. And so I think if you feel like this last year is uniquely isolating, uniquely lonely, uniquely challenging, then I think that's quite hard to grapple with. But if you know that actually this is a natural mental thing you need to prepare for, that's important. The second thing is, if you're able to just start earlier and space out some of that work over more years, so you've got a much more significant share of your achievements and sort of accolades done before that last year, you just don't have as much pressure in the first place. And then I think the other thing is just making sure that like your whole family is really aligned behind the mission. So in my case, like everyone understood my goals. We were all really a tribe behind this. I think when you're going through a challenging family time, and there's like not an understanding of what everyone's going through and sort of potentially what pressure you have on your shoulders as an academic student in your last year, that's when perhaps you can sort of fall into a challenging state where there's unnecessary sort of tension around you and you're getting pulled in too many different directions. So I think unifying the family behind that sort of mission is important, a very critical step.
Yeah, that's really well said, man. Like it's such a great point that in the midst of challenge and hardship to actually dial down the uniqueness of it and the self of it, because it's easy to fall into that trap, being like, I have this goal, I am going to succeed, the success is mine, everyone around me, no one's applying to the States, this is uniquely mine. It can feel isolating, right? Because it's different. But at the end of the day, the feelings I'm feeling and the challenges I'm facing first are not unique. Humans face challenges every day of different kinds, and these feelings come up. And secondly, I can use my family and disperse this, the pressure that I'm some way putting on myself, disperse that around me. Because as you said, this is something you're doing for your family as well, right? It was a sense of duty. And I think a lot of people miss that part of when they're aiming high and they have pragmatic success in mind, they miss that part of sharing the load, right?
Yeah.
And how that is quite relieving.
I think that's right. I think the best students typically have a support system around them of close friends, of parents, of teachers typically as well, maybe an older sibling, that really provides that rock solid foundation. So when they're feeling low, others can pick them up. I think it's very challenging when you're on really literally isolated and parents don't know what you're going through, etc. So part of what you have to do is build the support system proactively. So in the good times, you're investing in those relationships. You're having people understand what you're aiming for. People are rallying behind you. You've got that cheerleading squad around you. So when you are stumbling, that they're there for you. Because I think it's obviously hard to build that support structure when things are going bad. So I think it's important that you're sort of investing time proactively in that well in advance and anticipating those really stressful moments.
Yeah, totally. That's important, and it's a hard skill to cultivate. it's in some ways easier to learn A-level maths, you know, because there's a syllabus for it, but it's harder to know how to build support networks and what that means in times of war and in times of peace, right? So how has that changed or stayed the same from that point at the end of high school? You know, you're a person who's had tremendous success in different fields and different times, but it's been consistent. So is there like is this the secret sauce that's sustained, or has that changed, or you know, have you evolved into different modalities of success?
Yeah, so I think the key thing is establishing the self-awareness to know how much you can push yourself and then where the limit is. So what I'm a deep believer in is you cannot get anywhere in life realistically, and anyone who tells you can, you know, I would challenge it. But Olympic athletes, top academic students, top entrepreneurs, whatever it is, you've got to put a lot of pressure on yourself because the stakes are high. What defines, I think, success is somebody who can find where their, you know, their barriers are, find where their capacity is for that pressure, push themselves to that limit, and operate close to that limit, and then operate at that close limit for a sustained period of time. And then when you're feeling like things are heating up, you can ease back a little bit. But as you get more and more experienced at yourself, your self-awareness, how you regulate your mood and stuff, you can amp the pressure because you can handle more and more. It's like going to the gym and building your, you know, your muscle capacity, etc. So I think, you know, in my own life, that year 13 experience is something where probably at points is almost pushing into like a bit of a scary zone. But you know, I was definitely pushing hard against the limit. And then when I saw that actually worked really well, I got into all the schools I applied for, all the work paid off. And I had really seen the manifestation of that sort of mindset come to fruition. I was pumped. And so I probably had a lot of extra energy, probably flooding into my tank for that next phase and for the sort of opportunities that awaited at Harvard. So I think the defining kind of like characteristic of, you know, my last, say, 8 years since getting into Harvard has really been continuing to extend the amount of pressure I can put on myself, the amount of, you know, simultaneous responsibilities, the amount of new units I'm launching or studies that I'm doing, whatever, and trying to just build that capacity over time and continuing to develop my understanding of myself and those, you know, support systems I have around me. And at this point, you know, I've got quite a developed ecosystem of people, which I think good entrepreneurs need to do to provide that support.
Okay, right. So, what is the dialogue that goes on in your head when you're approaching that, you know, mark? What's the dialogue to push through, and what's the dialogue to come back?
So I guess firstly, in terms of how you identify if you're at that point, you know, if you're a pretty rational fellow, and most people are, when something problematic comes up, you sort of rationally evaluate the risks, what can happen, you know, what can go wrong, you know, what happens if this contract, you know, doesn't get signed, what happens if I don't get into this program, whatever. The test, in my opinion, of when you're approaching that danger zone is when you start to irrationally worry about things, and you start to lose sense of that kind of cost benefit calculus, and things start to be getting blown out of proportion more regularly. You see that in terms of like your escalating mood. You might get angry faster, you might get sadder faster, you might snap people faster. And those scenarios where you start to lose the ability to see things for their, you know, actual intrinsic significance as opposed to blowing them out, that's when you know you're kind of getting into a bit of a danger zone. Because when small things start to seem like big deals, that's when, you know, you're in a troubled state. So I think you will often find yourself getting close to that area, and then you need to, you know, actually take the time to just, you know, reflect, potentially drop something, potentially take a different approach, you know, potentially go and reach out to one of those mentors that you've been cultivating, and then reset, and then keep pushing. But you have to be able to, I think, identify when you're nearing that state.
Right. That makes sense. So that's kind of, yeah, that self-awareness becomes really important to be able to catch yourself or note when you're, you know, maybe emotionally volatile, or when things in your thoughts seem enlarged and inflated, bigger than what reality is. And even when maybe you're overly attached to the outcome, I think that can also be a form of instability. So what's something currently that kind of takes you to that cliff? And can you give an example of that?
Um, yeah, sure. Something that takes you to the cliff. Okay, so um, let's here's an example. So when you're building a company as an entrepreneur, you're often hiring people, and significant hires can be transformative for the company. So I think about some of the executive hires I've made when some of these folks were quite young, and I took pretty big bets on people that from an age perspective were totally woefully lacking in experience, but I was betting on their mental agility, and they were able to really perform. Every so often you come across somebody who you really believe is a great asset for the company, as say a founder in my case, but you don't have team consensus. A lot of the team don't really see what you're seeing, and it appears really risky and unnecessary for them. And it can be pretty stress-inducing when you feel like this is a critical leap to make, and the team that usually is always behind you isn't behind you on that moment, and you've got to push against them and do it anyway. And upon doing that, you create all kinds of frictions because some of the existing organizational structure, some of the folks that have been around for a while, they might not understand the logic, and then in the short term, it seems like a chaotic decision. There's really a point to it, but it's not immediately obvious to them. So things like that, where your judgment as a leader is being questioned, but you have to take that hit because you believe that it is genuinely going to push the thing to the next level, is a good example of, I think, when you can get to that stress zone. It can lead you to snapping at your team. It can lead you to second guessing your logic. It can lead you to potentially taking the easy way out and hiring the more traditional candidate. That would be quite a concrete example that I've sort of recently seen.
Okay, so it's having a judgment and a choice that might be going against the people around you, and specifically in this case, it's picking people that on the surface might seem inexperienced and underqualified, but backing them, right? I'm gonna take a risk of my own and make a little link and hear what you think about it. It's almost as if you're finding the person who is working at the merchant yards, right? Who is actually competent and has skills way beyond what on the surface they might be doing.
I think that's bang on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and here's kind of, I think, how I think about that. So in doing Crimson, I see that society puts huge value on certain signals of success. It could be a degree, it could be an academic award, and so in general, it's going to be the case that people have this bias towards these certain institutions, but very regularly there's somebody who didn't necessarily have a certain trajectory. They missed out on going to certain schools, whatever, but they have this innate fantastic potential, but they seem like an untraditional bet. That's the first kind of case. The second case is around age. So a lot of the time, people they say they're okay with hiring young, talented, ambitious people, but when it comes down to hiring somebody that is really inexperienced from an age perspective and is very young, they start getting nervous and they think they should have the experienced hire. Now, this can be a really dangerous call, because sometimes if you believe in competency learning and you believe in the idea of the growth mindset and you believe in betting on someone's potential, actually a younger person who's going to be hungry to level up and hungry for this challenge and hungry to be rapidly upskilling will be more effective than this older experienced hire who might be slower and less agile and be more stuck in their ways. So these are two examples, both when you have to bet against traditional signals of success and when you've got to bet on someone who's actually quite inexperienced on paper, who can do a role really well.
It's really interesting, Jamie, because I think if we were to read your bio, we would presume your definition of success is, the signals, right? Is the school you went to, is the degree you got, is the awards you gained. But from what I'm hearing based on this is you admire and maybe value the hunger, right? Which is interesting because if we go back to year 13, it wasn't really getting that ducks or getting into Harvard. It was staying strong, it was that hunger despite what was happening around you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the most powerful things I've seen in thousands of students around the world, the folks that really, I guess, stand out to me is just that searing ambition. It's that belief they can improve, and the belief they want to improve, a belief they want to put themselves in the most challenging environment and keep improving. They want to put themselves in scenarios where they can fail because they are pushing just so hard. And it is that searing ambition that I think is very inspiring. And that searing ambition, particularly in a place like New Zealand, gets smothered because it's not acceptable to really be so ambitious. It's not acceptable to, say, hey, I'm trying to get into one of these awesome schools, and I actually don't want to go to, this local program because actually there's a better option overseas, but it's going to require, me to think of it differently. So I think definitely when you look at academics in high school, there are pretty traditional measures of success. I like how when you get into the working world, there are so many different ways in which your career can unfold, and that ambition can transcend into creative fields. It can transcend into academic research. It can transcend into a political or social movement that you really care about. But that relentless ambition to keep pushing and recognize that actually most things that turn out to be big successes, that you've got to push through a hell of a lot of doors to get there. I think that is, I think, such an incredibly important trait in the most effective students that I come across, and something that I really try and build in my students, that resilience and that belief that ambition is fundamentally a good and positive and powerful thing, and not something to be afraid of.
Makes sense. I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick. Give me. So what is something that inspires ambition in you these days?
So one thing I've really come to realize is that there are so many areas of society that can be, radically improved for the better. And there are so many areas of society that are currently filled with complacency, that are filled with a lot of institutional incentives to not change, and a lot of rigidity. And you see that everywhere. You see that in government departments, you see that in certain industries, you see that in education, particularly in an area that I'm very passionate about. And so, what is very motivating is the belief and understanding that actually to change any of these things, it requires you to run at these things with a force and, to keep pushing through more and more and more doors to make that change, and realize that actually anything disruptive by definition is going to, irritate some people in the status quo structure. It's going to face a lot of intrinsic skepticism and resistance until you make that change, and then people will assume it should have always been that way, and they'll say they were on the right for the whole time. So I've now seen both in education context, I've seen in terms of like a high performance context, I've seen in a political context through some of the work I did with the National Party. I've seen in other areas like health tech, and for example, transportation with companies like Uber and Didi in China, that you just really have to have the willpower to keep pushing to make these things change. And that can be a positive force, it can be a negative force. And things like, for example, Uber's disruptive growth around the world, there was plenty of criticism that could be leveled at certain areas of it, but there's definitely been plenty of benefits for society as well of what's been built there. So I think overall, when you understand that actually it does take you swinging a big mallet with a lot of force and running at things super hard to get anything done and changed, it is actually quite uplifting, because when you experience rejection and you experience doubt and you experience failure, you realize that it's just a normal part of the process. Just like we discussed earlier about how you're not alone when you feel a bit lonely in that last high stakes year of high school. You're not alone when you get your 40th rejection as an entrepreneur or something like this. That is a natural part of disruption. So I think that's a powerful mental state and principle to be aware of.
Yeah. I can see in that sort of lens, through that lens, it makes the ambition and pushing against force a means to an ends in itself, right? So an ends in itself, sorry. In that when you face resistance, it's just proof that you're pushing. Do you know what I mean? It's because I think ambition, you know, if you're tied to the change, like, you know, things are like I want things to be like B. If you're tied to the change, then the resistance to get from A to B is work, you know, is pain. Whereas it sounds like what you're describing is it's actually that pushing, that's when you know you're creating change, right? It's what you expect. It's like, look, here's A and it can be in B, and I'm interested in that pushing aspect, you know, the work it takes to go to B, because that's where I feel ambitious. That's where I feel like I'm in that line of, you know, pushing myself to my limits and finding that sweet spot.
I think it's really well said. And just building on that, pushing for pushing. So okay, every good disruption requires pushing, but also every product that fails also experienced pushing as well, right? So it's important that you don't mix these things up. So something that is truly disruptive has product market fit. So there are some people who think it's a clearly valid idea that are really keen to engage, and there's a whole industry of people that have that inertia that you need to kind of convince. There's a difference between that state and something where you have this idea, but just actually no one wants it, and you're pushing because literally there's no market for this change that you're trying to develop, or the business you're trying to launch, etc. So assuming that you have found at least a crowd of people that resonate with the purpose you're building, and you can see why over time it's going to create a ripple effect through the people that are not yet convinced and bring them along the journey. That's when you know you're kind of pushing in that powerful way. But it's important that you're able to, you know, triage between the two. You can't just assume any pressure is like a failure, because otherwise you won't actually get anything off the ground. But equally, you know, at a certain point you need to pivot, because there's a reason why you're, you know, encountering not like wooden walls, but like concrete walls that hurt to run into.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, there's kind of two insights that are crucial to having ambition as a primary form of strength, right? There's two insights. One is knowing that resistance means you're potentially doing the right thing and it's actually part of the journey. And two is to know when that is towards delusionary failure and when it's actually productive, right? And so for you, when was because it's a hard skill to develop these two insights and to practice and enact them. When was like the first time you can remember that you felt like this, where, you know, you develop that sensitivity of pushing is the right way to go, and how to know when it's towards success and when it's actually failure?
So actually, it's a really funny example. The example was when I first took my extra subject, which was thinking skills in high school. So basically, the status quo of high school is the school is incentivized, and whatever they say, basically, the traditional physical school is incentivized to get people to do similar things at the same pace, because it's easier for them to manage. There's less complexity, there's less staffing requirements, and it's just easier for everybody. So there is a drive towards average, a drive towards normalization, etc., that takes place. When I wanted to take extra subjects at my high school, and I wanted to do more A levels, I wanted to begin them earlier, there was initially pressure against that, right? So there was this idea that it wasn't necessary, or there was this idea that I didn't need to do it, or there was this idea that it would be too difficult. But once I embarked on some of those journeys, and I, for example, self-studied AS economics, and then I got a really good grade, I realized this is actually BS. Like this is actually just not. It's just fake. If you have the capacity, you can actually achieve way more during this time. So I got this insight doing, you know, one extra subject like thinking skills when I was pretty young in high school, and I think around 15. And I'd seen success taking my IG English language 1 year early, and topping the world on it. And then I realized actually I can crank this up. And so you saw, if you look at, you know, subjects per year, by the year 12 year, I had added, you know, probably 5 or 6 more subjects. And then for year 13, I added like 12 scholarships and sat 7 A levels that year. So that was an example where I realized the status quo rule, don't do more subjects, was flawed. And then I tested it and realized actually, okay, this is potential. And then I pushed against the status quo of the rules of the infrastructure of the school. And then bam, got a very disruptive result with my 10 A levels, was then able to get into kind of all the schools that I applied for. and then sort of established this sort of norm and precedent of taking more subjects. So that was an early example of sort of contrarian, or a lack of willingness to accept the status quo manifesting into change, deviation, turning into a fantastic outcome. And that gave me a lot of confidence that actually I had something to offer when it came to launching Crimson, because I had many different takes on the way to go about high school, but no high school was telling their students.
Right, it makes more and more sense. I can see how that journey in high school of testing the status quo is literally what you're doing now, in bigger scale. It's interesting because, okay, so that explains how you can identify when pushing against the status quo is productive and towards success, and it's also it's not impossible, right? And the things that make it seem impossible are actually a narrative of the status quo, and it's just how things are being done. And so then what's an example of where it was the other case in which there was the status quo and you pushed against it, but you realized there wasn't a crowd that was supporting you. You didn't have the cheerleaders to validate the journey and the push. And it was actually towards failure. And how did you learn to drop that?
Another example in high school is very vivid. Was in high school, one of my goals was to try and be a senior leader or a senior prefect, like a head boy, or senior school captain or something at King's. And the approach I went about this was emphasizing all of the like extra experience that I could bring to students, other activities that I could enrich the school with, better results I could help generate for students, etc. So it was very focused on outcomes. But what I realized is actually that's not what the average person wants. But the average person wants camaraderie, school spirit, a sense of identity, humor, a enjoyable, dynamic at school, a relaxed, down to earth kind of vibe. And so I realized that actually my perception of what a good school leader was, and what people wanted was actually quite different. And I saw this sharp difference when I shifted into a business leadership role. And actually, at that point, your job is really to win and to help your team, achieve success. And there are very clear outcomes you're pushing towards. And so I realized that I'm much more of a wartime outcome style leader than I am, the guy to roll a great party. So that kind of dynamic was a powerful personal learning as to where my sort of leadership deficiencies were, and where I could play, and the kind of people that I would need to surround myself with to sort of get the most out of my particular personal style. So that was a good example. I tried a leadership strategy, so to speak, and it failed. And there wasn't people that really, wanted it.
So it's interesting because, in that example, it's like you could choose to try to change the status quo and say like, no, this is the type of leader that's best for the school, or you can accept the model as it is.
I think it's right. And you think about this a lot in, for example, US presidential elections. So Andrew Yang comes along and he brings the idea of the universal basic income, which, for our listeners is the idea that everyone in America should receive a guaranteed paycheck every month, because there's incoming technology disruption that will render many millions of people out of work. Think about taxi drivers, think about people in restaurants that do manual work, basic clerical tasks. And so this is an important, step to create, income equality. Now, Andrew Yang, this is a radical idea, and it's not going to catch on to the mainstream, but it's actually interesting that there's enough narrative and debate about it that it, sort of establishes him as a important thought leader. But people don't have appetite for that kind of radical deviation in the leader normally for like, say, an overall country, which is why someone like Andrew Yang can be a disruptive voice that changes the discussion, like a Bernie Sanders. But ultimately, it is more common that you see like a centrist candidate tending to win in these large democratic countries like America, like a Joe Biden, for example, at this current time. So I think that's an example where, in my leadership, tiny context in high school, but then in the political context, like there really is a market, like what do voters want? how much change they're willing to handle, how much deviation is exciting for them, and how much is just too much and sort of turns them off. And you may have a person with all the right ideas, but they could just be 10 years too early. Maybe if you take climate change, if you run on a heavy climate change campaign, back in, say early 2005, 2010, it probably doesn't resonate, to be honest. But only now, when there's a different level of prioritization in the average person, that kind of thing really, really resonates. So I think there's some examples in which you've got to kind of find that market and find that sort of willingness to embrace disruptive thinking, or recognition that you're actually just getting rejected because people don't want the idea right now.
And it's interesting to like, there's changing the status quo, and then there's changing how you relate to the status quo, right? And I'm thinking back to high school, where it's kind of like, this is the system, and I don't have to conform to the system. I can act independently from it, and challenge the narratives, but I don't need to change the narrative. It's two forms of change. It's pushing against the resistance of the narrative, and then there's actually recreating the narrative.
I think it's bang on, and you probably need to think about exactly what kind of change you are trying to stir, and what you're happy with. So something like, say, the Me Too movement, it's clearly a moment where there needs to be massive societal like reconfiguring of what is acceptable in terms of guy-girl interactions, and how people in positions of power use them and how they interact when they have those positions of power. That's the kind of thing where it's sort of a mass disruptive change, as opposed to an incremental one. Nobody wants the Me Too movement for there to be a small increase in the penalty for sexual harassment in the workplace. It's more a fundamental redefinition of what's acceptable. So I think it's important to know when you're pitching something that's incremental and builds margin on the status quo and can sort of like nicely fit in the existing infrastructure, and when you're really trying to burn down the house, with something like, say, the Me Too movement, where they're really trying to burn the foundations of the expectations that were accepted for a long period of time in many of these traditional institutions, from government to business to media, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting with burning down the foundations, because it ignores the reasons why the foundations were there in the first place. It ignores the tradition. It assumes that tradition is ultimately flawed. And there's a reason why things are a certain way, and a lot of them might not be good, but there's a lot of babies in those oceans of bathwater. So it's interesting when you're in a framework of disruption to know where the baby is and what is the bathwater, and to know when you're burning something, like why are you trying to burn something down? Like, what's the visceralness of it? I don't know. Yeah, something.
I think a recent example of this that really struck me was the riots in Sydney around the COVID lockdowns. And I was chatting to this waiter in Greece, and he talked to me about how there was this first lockdown in Greece and everyone sort of took it quite seriously and they were really concerned. And then a year later, they tried another lockdown and people just really weren't having it. And they were really sort of not listening to the rules and really not taking it very seriously. I think about the Sydney lockdown, where you saw this groundswell of protest against this lockdown, and people that really felt like their liberties were being infringed in a pretty meaningful way. And they were taking to streets and actively sort of pushing against what a significant portion of society was pushing towards, which was a lockdown that got people out of this COVID frenzy faster. So I think these are powerful examples, because initially people are happy to tolerate a meaningful incremental change to their lifestyle, but if you kind of read the sentiment wrong, that can really wind people up, and they can pull out their pitchforks and try to burn things down. Which I think we saw with the sort of Sydney protests a little bit, at least metaphorically.
Yeah, it's hard to know. Yeah, the incremental change versus the radical change. I wonder for you, like, so once you've kind of left the institutions, high school and then university, or acting in the world, how are you picking your battles, your challenges, where your ambitions targeted towards, which status quo you're challenging and what you're trying to disrupt? Because especially thinking of young people, it's easy in high school to know what your battle is. Can be academic, social, it can be sport based, but there is a very standardized template. Whereas when you choose a career and you're acting in the world, it requires some self-awareness to know what is meaningful to you. So how do you negotiate that?
Hmm. Okay, I'll kick that one to you. What do you think?
Um, I think it really is, for me, knowing what's unique in my lived experience. And it comes out as a sense of duty in that, given what I've experienced, it's the one thing that I can do. It's a call to action that is meaningful in its uniqueness. So yeah, like my experience of um, resilience, mental wellness, and understanding people, um, as well as going through a journey of understanding myself, has been so unique and part of my lived experiences, that working from that place is what I find meaningful. And then the status quo thing is less relevant to me. It's more of a byproduct. So whatever stands in the way of that expression, that's where the resistance may come. But it's not defined as a challenge to the status quo, I don't think.
Got it. I think that makes a lot of sense. So basically, you're kind of saying you're happy to innovate in your own island, as long as you're not encountering disruption. I mean, encountering a barrier, and then if you are encountering a barrier, then you'll start pressing against it. But you're not sort of actively hunting for opportunities to push against walls for the sake of it. Only if it's necessary and a smart path.
Yeah, exactly. And what I'm hearing from your story is you've built the strength and sensitivity to know when it's worth pushing against status quo and challenging it. And that strength has given you sort of like arbitrage in a sense to find it similar opportunities and do well. Is that, would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think so. I would say the particular strength you want to cultivate is when you're pushing against these walls. Some people can feel demotivated, and others can be charged by the challenge. So I think if you can find within yourself the ability to actually be amplified when you get pushed back. So it's kind of like a kinetic energy equation where you keep getting more and more and more charged up as you encounter the resistance, as opposed to getting knocked down. That's when you get like real momentum building, because you are genuinely inspired by the fact that these barriers exist, and you think they have to be knocked down. So in my case, within the education environment, I think when I get some sort of group or some organization or an individual or something that is sort of standing in the way of really logical change that I think is really necessary and validated and makes sense, that actually motivates me to kind of push harder, because someone's got to kind of do it. So I think one thing that I just add to your equation is how the existence of these barriers adds fuel to the equation, is important. Does it charge you up? Do you get more pumped, or do you get depressed? Does it actually suck energy from you? And that balance is important.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like the battle you've picked and the resistance you've taken upon yourself is the educational world and access to education. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of factors that make high schools the way they are, but I think they really underserve basically everybody that goes through them in different ways. They could be radically improved and just have many barriers to change. And I think finally, through a combination of um, uh, online education, awareness of opportunities, global borders, video conferencing technology, a lot of different things coming together, there's a real ability to challenge and, supplement / disrupt different aspects of, this, very long-standing high school infrastructure that's been around. I think starting with college admissions is interesting because you can challenge the conception of where people should go and what their potential is and where they need to reside, and how significant where they're born has to be in terms of where they end up. But I think the broader opportunity to challenge the assumptions that underpin a traditional high school, I think it's very exciting.
Right. It's interesting in hindsight. It makes so much sense that this is your hill, right? For two specific reasons. One is you've had that family experience of when education was a barrier and what it means to transcend that, starting with your granddad and then your mum pushing against that and then you pushing against that. And then the second is when your direct experience in high school, when you did push against it and you found success, and now it's a bigger version of that and it's helping so many people. So it's easy to say that in hindsight. I wonder for kids in high school or in college or wherever they are who don't have the benefit of time to look back and make a nice narrative of things, how can they identify what is meaningful and relevant to them?
It's a good question. I think exploration, where you basically so most kids in high school, they just don't try many things. So they're only exposed to like a couple of different potential options. And, if you just change sort of being exposed to 3 things, being exposed to 25 things in, a pretty rapid way, you're going to much more quickly converge to like what you actually want to do. Same thing's true if you can accelerate the speed with which you go through core concepts, whether it be math or science, whatever, and you quickly figure out kind of where your strengths are and where you want to play. So overall, like I think you need to ramp up the exposure to all the different varying fields that could be possible, help the child find their intrinsic motivation earlier, and then from there kind of like unlock the beast. Because most students that I see that thrive ultimately are intrinsically motivated and that they want to do well for themselves, at least for a significant majority of their motivation. And so I think it's about finding that quick velocity of discovery of things, whether it be coding or architecture or fine arts or social activism or whatever, robotics, that gets them really sparked up and cranking.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exposure and just, I guess, rapid involvement. Yeah. Cool. That makes sense. Is anything else that you think is relevant in what our format is and what we're trying to talk about?
No, I think that was great.